So, as I said, ladies and gentlemen, this topic is financing Africa's future. And as we all know, finance is a much-needed catalyst that assists to fuel economic development. But Africa really is not poor. Quite some years ago, I remember when Tony Blair set up the Commission for Africa, there was a sort of punchline he had that began, "Africa is poor." And I took exception to that. I simply don't agree. I personally think that the continent is extremely rich, potentially, but maybe we could think of it's like a hungry man sitting on a chest full of gold bars, and he doesn't know that he's sitting on all that money. And the challenge really is perhaps to find the catalyst that opens that chest and allows the money to come into circulation. The finance panel is going to look at the role of finance in enhancing Africa's growth trajectory and opportunities both within and outside the continent. Our panelists will discuss, amongst other themes, inclusive economic management and sustainability, the role of microfinance and foreign direct investment, FDI, as emerging markets in Africa, and new financial structures and fiscal policies steering Africa's engagement with the global economy. The discussion aims to shed light on the impact of these investments, to share best practices, and highlight both challenges and opportunities affecting inclusive growth, entrepreneurship, and innovation in Africa. And the moderator for this panel will be Gavin Serkin. Gavin, over to you.
Thank you very much. So, contrary to some of your brochures, I'm not Jonathan Rosenthal from The Economist. They found a white guy with glasses to fill his place. I'm a journalist as well. As Jonathan, I used to work at Bloomberg. I headed up the emerging markets team there, and I wrote a book, which you have on flyers of, called Frontier, Exploring the Top 10 Emerging Markets of Tomorrow, which is a Bloomberg Wiley book. It was a look at the top performing investors and seeing which countries they liked for the next 10 years, the countries that they thought were exciting places to invest in. They would have challenges, they would have commodity cycles, bumps along the road with politics, but the countries that you would always go back to looking for that opportunity when prices were a bit cheaper, you'd go in there. Out of those 10 countries, 5 of them are in Africa. So that gives you an idea of the support from the investment community for Africa if things can go in the right direction. So what we have here is a panel of experts from all different fields of looking at how financing works in Africa. What we'll do is we'll go one by one, have a little Q&A with each of these panel members, and then open it up to the floor for your questions. So first of all, I want to introduce Ibukun Adebayo, who is from the London Stock Exchange and deals with the emerging market and private equity primary markets, I should say, for the London Stock Exchange, and dealing with a lot of interaction with stock exchanges within Africa. And one of the success cases last year was in Nigeria with achieving the dual listings between equities in Nigeria and being able to trade those here in London as well. So I guess to open up the conversation, what would you say are the biggest challenges that you face in interacting with stock exchanges? There's been success cases, but where are the frustrations?
Thanks, Gavin. I think maybe just to say a couple of things, first of all, before I answer that question directly. First of all, thank you very much to the organisers and to the other LSE for allowing the other LSE into the building. And when someone said we had an Africa Summit, I said, I'm certain we haven't got one, certainly not on a Saturday, but evidently I've woken up now and everything is fine. We, as the London Stock Exchange Group, are quite a diversified stock exchange. We are not really a stock exchange anymore. I think we're more of a marketing and financial services company. We have an extensive portfolio of services that are available for other financial services and market infrastructures globally. And we've intertwined ourselves with the African exchanges because they are at the most exciting point of growth and development, and the opportunity to take the 400 years worth of mistakes that we've made and turn that into exciting opportunities for democratized flows of capital across Africa. So from that regard, we see this as an important juncture in the growth and development of the continent and the deepening of those capital markets. The first thing to say about the LSE's credentials very quickly is that we have listed on the London Stock Exchange 113 African companies with a combined market capitalization in excess of $220 billion. If you take that into context, that actually makes the LSE the largest equity stock market for Africa outside of Johannesburg. It's larger than Nigeria, Morocco, Kenya, and Egypt combined. So as a stock exchange, we have a huge responsibility to bringing the capital flows that exist through London directly to the continent. So Gavin, back to your question. There are some major challenges that are continuing to, I suppose, stunt the growth of African stock exchanges. A lot of them are well documented, and you here as budding entrepreneurs and as academics right now will be very aware of them. You can do the research on a desktop. So it is the issue substantially around liquidity. How do you get liquidity into key markets? A market like Nigeria is trading something in the region of $10 million a day, which is effectively the same amount of trading for an entire market that you'd find in a company at the bottom end of the FTSE All-Share in London. The other challenges that continue to exist are a lack of financial depth across the continent, which is primarily on the basis of policy and regulatory gaps, which have yet to be fulfilled and yet to be discovered in some instances. Indeed, on top of that, information asymmetry in and across the continent, actually providing information for investors to invest on and take those investment decisions. It's fine if countries have started doing that, but not all the information is the same. And then finally, transparency and governance. The continent has struggled with this challenge over time, but we are seeing signs of improvement. So I think to outline the 5 major challenges, those would be the ones.
Okay, and not to hone in on the challenges, because there's also been some successes. We were talking before, you were mentioning the Casablanca exchange as one particular breakthrough. So talk a bit about that.
Absolutely. So Casablanca faced a challenge previously, dropping out from MSCI's emerging market index down into the frontier index. And what that effectively does is chokes off the air supply of capital to companies that are in the country. The wall of cash fell something in the region of 30 to 40% as a result of that. So getting Casablanca to become much more intertwined with the international market and to be able to receive those flows was something that we talked to directly the authorities in Morocco to see whether we could become a partner for that. So providing a much more sophisticated equity trading platform, for example, one that could receive, for example, like them or loathe them, the opportunity for high-frequency traders to come in to create a new ecosystem based on more up-to-date technology was key. That was one aspect of the developments that happened in Morocco. The second was to build platforms for SMEs, or small and medium enterprises, to raise capital. There's always been a misnomer that what you simply do is create a new segment within a market and you label it SMEs, and suddenly lots will list there and lots of people will actually trade them there. That's absolutely not the case. And what Morocco has done is taken the realization that you need to build from scratch an infrastructure. Small cap focused investors who will only ever focus on small caps will never change with the wind if the trend for small caps goes away. Brokers, market makers, other key market participants focused purely on building and developing that sector. Another key element. And the result is the lifeblood of the economy in Morocco is in the millions of SMEs that are there, not just the 20 or 30 large cap names that are listed on the main market. And then I think the third way in which we've been developing a good partnership with Morocco is really in terms of regulation and predominantly trying to find and fill those policy and regulatory gaps, providing robustness on the issue, for example, of insider trading, providing more clarity in terms of what we call related party transactions, where you absolutely must keep the vested interests of a company owner away from that company's from that owner's ability to influence core decisions in the business beyond what it should be. And I think these are areas where we've seen distinct change, and that can be recognised from not just a regional perspective, but also from a global perspective.
Okay, so that's the perspective from the stock exchange. Now, the next panellist is Vera Songwe, who is from the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, which is the World Bank's financing arm. And Vera, maybe talk about your experience of some of the successes that you've seen in Africa recently. And again, we were talking before, and we were discussing the Azura as being a particular milestone, a breakthrough in financing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. It's an interesting afternoon in London. It's not as warm. I just flew in from Washington. It's raining here a little bit, so I'm glad that you came to listen to investing in Africa. I think I was sitting here thinking to myself, if they're all here, it means they're thinking of going back to invest on the continent. That's a wonderful thing, because there is an amazing amount of opportunity there. So thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thanks to the organizers for getting us here today. It hasn't been always an easy task, and we're very honored. I'm personally very honored to be here with you today. So I'm coming from the IFC. IFC is one of the largest financial investor in Africa today, development institution. In 2004, we invested about 163 million on the continent. In 2015, we invested 4 billion. This gives you a sense of sort of the growth, the opportunity, and the fact that I think as an institution, we're quite bullish on the continent. We believe that the continent is going to continue to rise. We are, I think, as we were saying, long-term investors. We are there for the long term. We actually also believe that what we need to do is invest mostly in the mid-cap. We're doing some large investments, particularly because, of course, you need energy. And every time that you talk about investment and growth on the continent, one has to start with energy. But just before we go to that, I'd like to say three things. I think we have seen a continent where over the last 15 years has been growing sustainably. When we talk about Africa, everybody thinks you're talking about sort of one, monotonic entity. Africa is very diversified, but even as diversified as it is, we've had good stories, we've had positive stories across that diversity. We've had less conflict, Ashish just spoke about political change and transfer and stability in Nigeria. We've seen it in Benin. We're seeing more and more stability across the continent, big, small, large. We've seen poverty reduce by 10% in 10 years, never before seen after Cape Verde, now in Mauritania, who would have added those two together. So I think the continent, every piece of the continent, again, has, I think, something that is quite powerful. Why is that? Because collectively, the macroeconomic stability on the continent our leaders have been doing a much, much better job at managing the economy. Yes, it is true, commodity prices have fallen, and there are strong headwinds right now. But that means that we have a second round and a second wave to stop and look at what else is there, what are the other opportunities, and that's where institutions like ours come in. The IFC, we begin to say, yes, we spent the last 10 years basically bringing back stability, bringing back fiscal discipline, bringing back macro balances, working on the capital markets, ensuring that the financial sector is stable. Today we need to go to the infrastructure. We need to begin to provide the energy. 690 million people on the continent still do not have access to electricity. It means that every one of you can start a solar business or a protein business and you will do well and do very well. When we talk about cell phones, 40% of cell phones are energy. When we talk about agriculture, 25% of powering any agricultural Feed Africa program is energy. So there we have a very big niche where actually 75% of all the energy projects that closed on the continent last year were done with IFC in coordination with other financiers. What do we do? Cameroon, Nachigal, we were able to mobilize $1 billion from private investors. One of the things we do, because a lot of our governments will not be able to finance this infrastructure development on their own. So what we do is mobilize. We have a mandate to mobilize for every dollar to try to mobilize $3. And I'm happy to see we mobilize from London. We have an office and a treasury in London. We mobilize with my colleagues from Standard Chartered. We have, as part of the World Bank Group, the IFC, the World Bank, and MIGA. So we have a unique opportunity to have both the policy side, and you talked a little bit about what we do on the policy side, putting in place regulation to improve the overall environment. Most of the utilities don't work very well. Then we can mobilize the capital, and then we have MIGA that guarantees that your investment will not be taken back, or today when we talk about the foreign exchange issues that are going on the continent, that you will be able to have your capital offshore as you will want it. So that's, I think, a very, very important thing. The macro stability has come. Now we're moving into how do you finance infrastructure. Water is something we need to finance better. Roads is something I think we were just talking a lot. Ashley talked about going across the continent. Open skies. How do we do open skies? The only way we can go around the continent is open skies. We're financing Kenyan Airways today. We're looking at financing a lot more airways. We're trying to get into Ethiopian. I think there is a lot that needs to be done to make sure that if the continent is going to trade within itself, then it has to facilitate its logistics. We just closed a $1.2 billion Terma port, Ghana, upgrading Ghana's ports to make sure that we can, again, increase the speed of commerce. In all of these projects, what do? We mobilize foreign external capital onto the continent in a way which is sustainable, which is profitable, and which is most especially inclusive. In the case of the Ghana port, for example, when we say we finance the Ghana port, it seems as if, yes, you finance one big piece of infrastructure, but it creates 50,000 jobs because the cocoa comes faster. The cocoa gets out of Ghana faster. The small and medium enterprise is easier now to export your goods because you have a much more logistics base, which is much faster, much more developed, and also more professional. We get a lot more women now who can actually do better business because we have that port. One of the things that we do a lot is finance women. We do a lot of initial venture capital, financing small and medium enterprises where we put our own equity, stake in the game. We actually go out there and work with small businesses to see how we can bring that together. And I think that is really the next stage, is how we can transform all the capital that is sitting in London and Paris and the United States into Africa, where you can actually make a good return. How can we bring that there, make it long enough, and make sure that many of you, when you decide to start your business, do not have to set up out of the continent, but on the continent, and continue to grow.
Okay, Vera, a lot of money, though, is not just coming from the likes of London, it's also coming from China. To what extent is the IFC looking over its shoulder in a competitive situation with China, or are there areas where you're collaborating with China?
Competition is always good. So I think, of course, there's been a lot of, 3 years ago when President Xi Jinping came on the continent, he promised $60 billion of investment onto the continent. And I think there's a lot of countries that are making sure that they can have access to those resources. Are we competing with China? Yes. Are we working and collaborating with China? As we all know, and I think as everybody has read in the news, there is the Asian Infrastructure Bank that has just been set up. The IFC is actually providing technical assistance to, we are one of the longest standing, if not the longest standing development institution in the world. So we know how to do it. We've learned from our mistakes and we're improving. So when new banks come on the market, we work with them. One of the things that we did very recently with the Chinese was they gave us a line of $3 billion of credit, which we could use as IFC to co-finance any development projects on the continent. It was used in a year and a half, just to give you a sense of how much uptake there is. So we are actually working with them. I think one of the things that we bring as an international financial institution is also the safeguards and the environmental and social standards. We have a lot longer experience with that, and so we can bring it. Something that is very important is, as IFC, we have been financing a lot of green growth in China, which has helped to plummet the prices of solar panels and all the renewable technology that we see today. And that has now helped us to be able to take Chinese developers from China into the continent with much cheaper prices. And so we're building those relationships. Another relationship we're just building with the Chinese is in Tanzania. The Chinese are actually developing a technology of green growth housing. So financing of housing finance, which is a development sector that we're getting into now because of urbanization on the continent. We're looking and working with the Chinese to see how we can build climate smart housing at the most cheapest prices. The Chinese have the technology because they're faced with that same problem. And so we're now partnering 1 or 2 Chinese companies to do that. So yes, there is competition between the Chinese and ourselves because of course, everybody wants the best return. The Chinese in some cases are much faster, but we have the knowledge. We have been in this country for much longer. So on the policy front, we know how to talk to government. We know how to ensure that the development that is happening is inclusive. So I think that is what's happening with the Chinese. On one hand, they're bringing competition. On another hand, they're helping us reduce prices. And on another, they're bringing new technology into the continent. And together, we're growing.
Okay. Got to be very careful about how I make the next link because the next gentleman is William Asiko, who runs the Investment Climate Facility for Africa, but it doesn't have anything to do with green projects, as we were just talking about, but about the investment climate and whether countries are doing the right thing in terms of making their countries safe for investors to come in. William, I want you to talk about a couple of countries that are doing it right and maybe look at some things that aren't, where your challenges are.
All right. Thank you very much, Gavin. And let me just preface my remarks by saying something about investment climate. I had one of the participants come up to me and said, I'm really looking forward to hearing you talk about how you are going to finance climate change in developing countries. And so it's actually quite important to make this distinction because there is a misunderstanding. Investment climate, the best way to explain it is investment climate is the dollar poorer cousin of climate change. Climate change is sexy, people like to talk about it. Investment climate is dull, it's boring, but it's equally as important and particularly to Africa's success. I think a lot has been said about Africa's growth. The narrative about Africa rising is something that I think everybody in this room is very familiar with, but probably has very different views and beliefs about. I mean, it depends from where you're speaking from. But I think we all agree that today, I think a word that was used earlier is that this narrative has stalled. But even when the Africa Rising narrative was probably at its height, there were a number of things about it that people questioned. And there were the most important one was why wasn't the growth that everybody was talking about in Africa helping to reduce the levels of poverty that we were seeing, or helping to reduce it as fast as people would think those rates should. And I think there are a number of reasons for it. I think that investment climate as a whole had something to do with it. And what is this investment climate? Let me give some examples of why I think this investment climate was a hindrance to this growth converting into jobs and poverty reduction. The first thing, investment climate goes to how government actually operates and how particularly it operates towards the private sector. In Africa, you tend to have government as being a very key player in the private sector. For a number of reasons. I think government should be a regulator, it should be an enabler, but I think in many African countries you find governments go a bit further than that. Governments are a player in the investment space itself. One of the things we know about today is many power projects of which, Vera spoke how important power is and energy is, but many power projects are stalling because the key buyer of the power that is being produced remains a public utility, a government-owned entity that in many cases is bankrupt or nearly bankrupt, and only operates on the fact that it is virtually a department of the government. Government needs to get out of business, and government needs to let business do the things that are of a commercial nature, and stay with its role of being a regulator. We also heard this morning when we were talking in the telecom sector about government policies being a hindrance. Again, it's incredibly surprising to me how many governments in Africa just don't have any policies around competition or around promoting the private sector. They say the right things at the political level. You hear heads of state, ministers, heads of government talking about how they want FDI, how they want domestic investors. But if you click one level down to how the government is actually working and interacting with these businesses, you often hear stories of frustration. You often hear stories of hindrance to further development. You often hear stories where the private sector is just banging its head against the wall because a government-owned entity is being allowed to do things that a private-owned entity is not being allowed to do. So there isn't a level playing field. And government really needs to fix this if we're going to have it. Another big area in which I think government operates and has hindered the private sector is the whole area of rule of law. Now, rule of law is a big thing, and of course politics plays a big part in that, but there are other parts of it that are actually what I call low-hanging fruit. For example, a private investor invests in country A. It's a long-term, big, perhaps, infrastructure project, with a 25-year return. How confident are they that if in year 3 of this investment, the government wants to review the tariff, which wasn't part of the agreement, that they can go to a court in that country and have a fair and objective judgment issued by this court? Not many countries in Africa can show that they have independent judicial systems that can produce those kind of results. Again, these are things that are not difficult to fix. These are things about behavior change, these are things about technology, these are things about capacity building. They're not really difficult things to do. And then the last area is international trade. I think this has been talked about quite a bit. Again, a lot of the challenges that Africa has with trading with the rest of the world and trading with itself have got to do with the question of capacity. Ports are too small, they're over-congested. But again, a lot of it has got to do with bureaucracy. All the pieces of paper and the government departments that you've got to take from one department to another, these increase the amount of time it takes a container to clear through a port, sometimes by weeks. If you compare the average time of clearing a container in Africa with the best in class, which is Singapore, it's 34 days in Africa versus 36 hours in Singapore. For the same container to go through a port. Now, part of that is that Singapore has got a huge capacity, but a lot of it is because Singapore's clearance systems are all electronic, and there is no time wasted on decision making. And this is, I think, where we need to get to. We will hear a lot of things about, comparing one place to another, and I've done it myself, comparing statistics. I just want to say, as I close, that let's all be careful about comparisons without putting things into context. I personally learned about comparison being a very dangerous thing from my son, who is now 15 but was 10 at the time. And he was not performing as well as we and my wife and I thought that he should be performing in class. And he had a friend who was doing, his best friend was doing much better than him. And,
I hope he's not watching this.
And so we said, look.
Is he in the audience?
No, but my wife is. And so we had a chat with him and we said, look, his name is Howie. Howie, you're not doing very well. Why can't you be like Tom? Look at Tom, he's doing this and this. And he didn't think twice about it. He just said, well, you've got to be careful. Tom has very clever parents.
Your wife is blushing, by the way, over there.
With apologies to my wife.
You may be going home on your own.
So put comparison into context. There's always a reason. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William.
So, final panelist is David Law from Standard Chartered, the regional head of corporate finance for the Middle East and Africa. And, financial institutions have had an extremely hard time in Africa. We all know about Barclays and that experience. How is Standard Chartered managing in Africa, and what's the outlook there?
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Well, look, firstly, I'm sure quite a lot of people in the room probably know a bit about the bank. We've been in Africa for a very, very long time, 150 plus years. Of course, Barclays have been as well, and it certainly was a bit of a shock to many of us that they've decided to pull out of the continent. I think it's a big mistake, and we as an institution think it's a big mistake. So I think the short answer to your question, Gavin, is we're very
bullish on Africa. We always have been. We wouldn't have been there for 150 plus years if we weren't, and we're not going anywhere. So we're definitely here to stay. I think, it's a very interesting period for Africa. In many ways, it's lucky that Jonathan's not sitting in the seat that you're in, because I would have given him a bit of a hard time. I mean, The Economist sort of fuel various themes on Africa. Sometimes they overdo this stuff. So I think the Africa Rising story was overhyped, to be perfectly honest with you, and I'm sure many people here would agree with that. Their latest cover, I'm sure you've all seen, is about getting Africa working. I think that's a bit more feet on the ground. I actually agree with quite a lot of the commentary that they wrote in the edition that just came out last week. Look, at the margin, you will always get an emerging market, sort of what I call hot money or trend investors, right, who come in and go out. We actually don't want that hot cash in a place like Africa. You have to be there and have to be capable of staying the course. I mean, our role as a bank is, at the end of the day, to facilitate capital flows, both locally and internationally. And we have a big advantage that we're both a local bank in the 16 markets that we operate in, but we're also part of a global bank as well. So at its most basic, and we spend quite a lot of time talking about small and medium-sized businesses, we fund those businesses in local currency with the deposits that we take locally in the market that we may be in. So in Kenya, for example, we very much have a very strong local currency business. When it comes to the bigger projects, like the Azuras of this world, where we worked very, very well with Vera and her colleagues at the IFC, there obviously our role is to facilitate and organise large international capital flows to get a project like that financed. Yes, I think Africa, the next couple of years are going to be challenging, and we know that the macro story has slightly turned unfavourable. Having said that, I don't think access to capital was actually an issue, to be perfectly honest with you. And I don't think the IFC or the World Bank necessarily do either. Vera and I were talking before this panel. The biggest challenge that the both of us see actually is projects which are in a form that we can actually finance, what we call bankable, that have been developed to a sufficient stage that financiers like us can actually then go on and actually raise the financing. So if anything, that's one of the biggest issues. It's not a capital problem for Africa as such. And there's clearly lots of projects and ideas out there. What we actually need is everybody in this room and multiples of the people in this room to go back to Africa and actually help us get these projects into a sufficiently developed stage where we can actually fund and finance them.
Okay, no pressure, everyone. But one of the big issues that African countries have faced, particularly Nigeria, is the local currency. And we've seen a struggle for investors coming into the continent in different places in Africa. What's your outlook for Africa in terms of the countries that are going to find themselves in financial trouble, are going to need to call on the IMF for help? What is this year, next year going to look like?
Well, it's a country-by-country discussion, actually. And obviously the commodities boom that sort of fueled a lot of Africa's growth, largely driven by the Chinese, has come to an end. And that's impacted dramatically certain countries, and the fall-off in the price of oil, which we all know. Angola and Nigeria, just to pick on two. There's a lot of Nigerians in the room. But actually, there's also a benefit, by the way, to a lot of other countries that are probably also in the room, right? So lower energy costs is actually good for many countries in Africa. So it's not all doom and gloom, the correction in energy prices. I mean, to pick up on a couple of examples, I mean, I think in Nigeria, there may be people in this room that disagree with me, but I don't think you'll get away from the fact that at some point a devaluation will have to happen. And if you don't go down that route, essentially you're going to kind of constrain the Nigerian economy to the point where it's almost at a standstill, and that has almost happened today. Now, obviously, it's a complicated political dimension to that story as well. But you could well see, the IMF having to intervene in the short term in Nigeria if politically they want assistance. We're obviously seeing it in Angola. So both those cases are caused by the depressed oil price, essentially. But look, I think I actually spend a lot of my time personally in East Africa, and you go to East Africa, it's a very, very different story, right? And actually lower energy prices, as I mentioned, are actually good for those markets, and it's a very vibrant part of the world, and a part of the world where we at the moment are extremely bullish. So again, you know, you're in danger, Africa, it's not one country, we all know that in this room. You've got to get into the specifics market by market.
All right, I want to open up to the floor now for questions. Yes, lady at the front. If you can say who you are and direct the question to a specific person or to the entire panel.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth. This question is for the entire panel, sorry. My question is, in Europe, most countries use one common currency, the euro. Do you think if Africa was to adopt something like one common currency, it will make financial economy a lot easier? And obviously with the price exchange rates, I'd just get your opinion or what your thoughts are.
That's a very brave question to ask in the United Kingdom.
Who wants to take that one? There's enough trouble for countries managing their own currency, let alone with others, but go ahead, Vera.
I can attempt an answer and then we will start. I have one advantage. I come from a country that shares a common currency with a couple of other countries, the CFA zone. I think that what that has done for the CFA zone in a time of turbulence was provide, the economies with the stability that we would not have seen. And I think that if one of the reasons we can talk about growth on the continent over the last 10, 15 years is precisely because there was discipline around monetary policy. I mean, we see, and I think one of the discussions we're having today is, should countries adjust automatically or not? And the fact that when you don't have a political establishment in place that can do that, or a monetary establishment in place more precisely that can do that, then having a single currency that sort of delinks monetary policy from political policy is a very important thing that one needs. I think secondly, what that does is there is an argument that what it will do is it takes away one lever of your policy space. But I think exactly as Bill said, there is so much in the space of the sort of competitiveness that still needs to be done. And when we do work, I'm now doing a paper on sort of the advantages and disadvantages of the common currency of the CFA. And we see that none of the CFA countries has reached its potential and export potential, basically because there are all the structural issues, labor market policy rigidities, logistic problems, energy, access to finance, that have not been handled and done adequately. So my sense is I think one needs that. In that zone of countries, I think it's working because there is a history there. Now in East Africa, there is a discussion about moving to a single monetary union. I think it's going to take a lot of time to build because now we are in a very different financial environment with Basel III. You will need to make sure that all the banks in East Africa at least are up to Basel II standards with the new legislation on know your client, on associate banking. I think it's going to be a lot more difficult, I think, to bring that new policy into being today on the continent. So my sense is, for the countries where we have it already, let's keep doing it until we can bring, some of the back behind the scenes legislation and strengthening into place. And for where we don't have it, I think it's okay that the countries stay unique, and Ghana can manage its currency and South Africa can manage its currency and do it well. And you don't necessarily need all of us to go behind one currency to make it work. First, we need to ensure that there is competition and competitiveness on the continent. Then we will begin to move, I think, almost naturally towards unification of some sort. If you don't have movement of goods and services, it's very difficult to have single currencies, and there's no clear point of why one needs it.
Anyone else want to give perspective on that? Okay. Yes, sir, in the middle there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Bradley, and I'm the founder of the St. Andrews Africa Summit, as well as a renewable energy startup. My question goes to Vera as well. So I wanted to know, first of all, whether the IFC offers supportive grants for startups to pilot their programs before the investment stage. And secondly, you spoke about financing Ghana's port. How stringent are the due diligence processes involved in this to ensure that the funds raised are actually being allocated to their intended use? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, IFC startups and due diligence on investing in ports in Ghana particularly.
Well, congratulations. You're one of those who is going back and looking to invest on the continent. So go talk to him. I think it's a good idea. We do actually need a lot more people going back to invest on the continent. Startups, we do invest in startups, and the ways in which we do that, we don't do it directly. We do very few greenfields direct B2B. We try to invest in funds that then invest in the startups, because basically startups, as you know, need a lot of hand-holding, and we just don't have the bandwidth to do that. We're 3,000 person institution. It sounds quite big, but we're not big enough to be able to do all the startups. So what we do is we work with funds, and then we provide support to funds to do the additional work that is needed for those startups. But I think startups in ICT technology, we had done in the past a lot of work in the technology space, mostly helping to privatize government platforms. But now we're sort of trying to go into broadband, into e-commerce, and so we actually with our AMC, the asset management company, where we take a lot of equity now, going into funding many ICT and climate. With COP21, we do have actually funds to de-risk our help in startup companies on the continent, and so that's also putting us in them. And Ghana Port, I think, of course, when you talk ports, you talk a lot of, safeguards, environmental and social. You need to displace people, and I think that's one of the things actually where today we're the part of the World Bank that actually we fund ourselves from the investments we make and from the resources we bring in. And surprisingly, we have a lot more, including developed companies that come to us not for resources for investment, not for money, but for knowledge on how you do social and environmental safeguards. How do you do a good mining company? For a very long time we did that, and now we're moving into many of the banks, and I'm sure that many of you know about the Panama Papers. There is the Know Your Client initiative, and basically how you make sure that every bank has a very good sense of who all the clients are and what we do. And so there's a lot of work that we do on that end in terms of environmental and social safeguards, what kinds of, in Nigeria, for example, what kinds of social coordination and consultations you need to do in an oil field. So we do have a template for that, working, of course, with CDC, the likes of CDC in the UK and others, to come up with standards that make sure that then when you go in for this big investment, each time you do it, you're not doing it anew, and you're not learning what to do. How do you displace people? How do you relocate them? And how do you compensate them? I think we're trying to develop structures for that, and we've done that in Ghana.
Yeah, I mean, I just to comment on that. I mean, the work that's done around these big projects like in Azura or ports. I mean, this is world class. It's as good as you'll get anywhere else in the world. So, the chance of misappropriation or funds going in the wrong places or not knowing exactly who you're dealing with are virtually zero, actually. The standards are world class, and so they should be, right? I mean, and that's what Africa deserves, and that's what organisations like ourselves in the IFC spend a lot of time getting right, to make sure that then, because the last thing we need is anything to go wrong on one of these big projects, right? It would be extremely, extremely damaging. On the first point, there's quite a lot of, and there has been a lot of talk, and again, to use that word, hype around private equity on the continent. Actually, what we need to see is more venture funding, early stage funding, and actually that's where the big opportunity is. Ironically, there's been quite a lot of private equity money raised for Africa, which are actually struggling to find a home, whereas actually there's a lot of people like entrepreneurs, like the people in this room, who are wanting to go back to Africa, start businesses like Ashish with a few $1,000s, and are struggling to get that initial kind of seed funding, and there really is a big opportunity there. And we as financiers need to spend more time figuring out how to plug that gap. And that's got a few more hands going up.
Thank you very much. It's been a very insightful conversation so far. My name is Ali Mabubakri. I'm the CEO of TechSem, and I'm on the advisory board of LSE Africa. My question is two fronts. The first is for Ibukun. Can you please share with us some of the learning points you had from the dual listing of Seplat on London Stock Exchange and also Nigeria? And also, the second question is for the lady from the IFC. Very interesting presentation so far. I wanted to find out from you, what inspired your decision to invest in MTN? I remember I spoke with the chair of MTN, and he was saying they approached the bank, Standard Bank then, to invest in them, and they were quoting a lot of World Bank figures that showed that it wasn't a feasible investment. And I understand that IFC was one of the first investors that invested in MTN. So what did you see beyond the World Bank data on GDP at that time that made you to invest in MTN? Because I understand it's one of the best investments you've made in a long time. Thank you.
Okay, so let's take the question first of all for Vera on MTN. What enabled you to invest in MTN, and what was the experience, I guess?
I mean, very quickly, we believed in the model. One of the things that we do a lot is South-South investment, where we try to bring investors from other parts of the continent into other parts of the continent, and MTN was precisely that we were taking at the time when there were many South African companies trying to go up to the continent, and they needed somebody who knew the market. And then just we're making a lot of money off of MTN, so, you know.
Someone has to.
The opportunity. We go in early, and so we take in, I think, we take early risk and we make early gains.
And Aline, just to answer your question on them, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with a company called Seplat Petroleum, which is an indigenous oil and gas company from Nigeria, which was the first upstream company to list on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, but simultaneously did a listing in London. And really that company saw benefits in listing in both markets, not just for access to a wider pool of capital, but also to meet its local content requirements by having a listed entity run by Nigerians, and therefore able to get much better advantages of opportunities there. I think what we've seen is that it's important, if you have two companies that are listed, that you link the liquidity pools, so that when you're trading a company, you don't have purely trading gravitate to one particular market and the other market essentially become moribund. So the idea and the challenge was, how do you get flows to run across both markets? And to do that, you normally have to have linkages between what we call central depositories. So with the Nigerian authorities, we created a link which was about $1 billion worth of investment. And for that now, a Nigerian today can sell his certificate of Seplat in London without any currency restrictions or flow issues, and gain advantage of holding Seplat for an ephemeral period of time or a long period of time in a foreign currency. This is an extraordinarily dynamic opportunity, which hopefully will be replicated not just in Nigeria, but in other parts of Africa as well.
Okay. Yes, the lady there in the white.
I'm a learning advisor at Shell for trading and supply operations. My question's to the whole panel. I think William made an important point about the dangers of comparison and the way in which it can limit sort of our understanding of a situation. So I was wondering if anyone could speak then to the impact of global rankings such as the doing business rankings and the global competitiveness rankings as well, and the impact that then has on entities that may be considering investing in Africa, and the fact that at times it does make people sort of reluctant to do so, and the fact also that some of the indicators do not necessarily reflect the realities on ground. So you may be comparing the likelihood of, I don't know, for example, something like getting malaria. That's fine in the context of Africa, but if you're comparing then working in that climate to working in Europe, it's not really a fair comparison. So yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, William, would you like to pick up first the importance of indexes and whether they're accurate, I suppose, and whether they're valid?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think the point I was trying to make, even though it was a little bit lighthearted, was that if you are going to compare, it's important to understand the background of what you're saying. Too often in today's world, where you have social media, Twitter, where news is a 24-hour cycle, people focus very much on a statistic, and then when it's compared, they make decisions based on that. And I think all I'm saying is click further down, try to understand the basis of the figures, try to understand what is happening. I think with indexes, you're always going to have criticism when you're trying to compare, you're trying to get an apples to apples comparison across a wide range of variables. And you know, the doing a business report done by the World Bank, I think, is an excellent example of that. You know, here is a report that is trying to compare apples with apples across the globe. Okay, and I think personally, I am a big fan of the Doing Business report. You'll be glad to know, Vera. I'm not one of its critics. I don't think in any shape or form that it's perfect, but I think it is the only document that exists today that gives an apples-to-apples comparison between countries on the ease of doing business. And I think it's hugely important to have that. You know, one thing that has heartened me greatly across my travels in Africa, I mean, ICF has projects in 21 countries across Africa, is when I go into a particular country to discuss, perhaps with the Ministry of Finance, who are our major clients, about a particular policy reform, that particular minister, he or she, will pull out the doing business ranking and say, listen, you know, we want to get from here to here, which is, you know, for me, is hugely heartening. First of all, that they actually know about it, you know, that they actually, you know, they're aware that it exists, and, you know, they actually care. The second thing is they actually care where they fit in within that ranking. You know, African countries, I think in the latest report, some African countries were the biggest and best reformers across the globe, you know, which again is another very, very good. I think that was very good. So it's not all doom and gloom, but again, let's remember comparison. We are coming off a very low base. So if we have 100 reforms in country A in Africa, and, you know, country B in Latin America or in Asia has 10 reforms, they may not necessarily be coming off the same base. And so the 10 reforms in Asia may lead to, you know, GDP growth that is far, far in excess of the 100 reforms in Africa. So it's always important to understand the basis behind whatever ranking that you're doing. Just go into a little more depth. You know, the Doing Business report, it's a 100-plus page document, but people focus just on the index. You know, read the whole document to understand what are the variables, what is it that they're measuring, and this gives you a much better perspective on what the rankings mean.
Got probably time for one or two more questions. Sir, in the tie, in the blue tie, just down here.
My name is Gary. So we've obviously seen a lot of investment and financing in Africa in history. But a lot of the times it's been with little value added or quite extractive in terms of extracting value from the continent. What advice, or what, from your perspective, should be done to prevent such extractive investments in the future? Thank you.
So promoting extractive investments.
Well, I can have a crack at that. I mean, it's a good question. It's quite a broad question. It was something that came up this morning, actually. If behind your question lies the impact of, you know, effectively foreign investment into Africa and then an extraction of that return back out of the continent, which I suspect it probably does, I personally am an advocate of not to be afraid of that, actually. I mean, I think you're looking at two. You're looking at the entry and you're looking at the exit, but you've got to look at the whole ecosystem around that investment, the jobs that are created, the taxes that are paid, the industries that are developed, and so on and so forth. I don't think the continent of Africa, or indeed the politicians that lead various countries, should be afraid of foreign investment. Obviously, that investment needs to be made in an appropriate and constructive and in a manner that is not in any way detrimental to the health of the country. And I think we can all think of examples of where investments have been made which have perhaps touched the boundaries of that. But Africa will not develop as a continent if it looks totally inward, in my view. And indeed, my own bank, you know, we've existed on the continent for 150 years. We are a foreign-owned bank, right? We are, while we operate in our local and all the markets, ultimately we're international and we're headquartered here in the United Kingdom. So it's case by case, but I'm not into these broad generalizations that somehow foreign capital is a bad thing, but I don't know what others on the panel think.
I think your question was maybe the backward part and the forward part, which is basically about maybe industrialization and how we go from exporting raw materials to processing. Again, I second, if you can export the raw materials and generate the growth, then do that. If you can begin to transform your cocoa into chocolate, do that. You still have to go to the market because the Ivorian market does not consume chocolates. So if you transform chocolates in Ivory Coast, probably that's a loss-making business. But if you can then improve your logistics and get those chocolates in 2 hours to Sainsbury in the UK or mass market in South Africa, then good. And I think that what the continent is now doing is going to that next stage of, you need the logistics, you need the energy, you need the transport to be able to transform and sell. And so I think that we're working on that. Growth on the continent has gone from primary to services. So there has been a little bit of that skip in the industrialization part, precisely because we haven't been doing well on the infrastructure. I think now the continent is working on infrastructure and industrialization will follow. But it is a logical question. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, but we are out of time. I see lots of hands up, but fortunately we do need to move on. But I want to thank the panel for an absolutely fascinating discussion.